One thing I wish I had learned earlier was that essentially it's okay if the idea has been done before. I think I probably threw away a lot of ideas because I saw that somebody else had written something similar. But pretty much everything has been written before, and you can always bring your voice to it, a new angle to it, new updates in the research, bring it to a different audience. If an idea is really good, there's different ways to get at it. And if you think, you have something fresh to add, you don't need to abandon it. And, in things, I was listening to a podcast the other day that was more about book writing, and they said sort of the same thing where, a lot of new writers will say, well, I want to write, a memoir about grief, but there's already books about grief, but that doesn't matter. Your story of grief is different. And there's always going to be a fresh audience of people who are losing people, and they're going to go to whatever the latest book is or article. And they don't necessarily know that 5 years ago, somebody else wrote something similar. So you obviously don't want to just, if you're pitching a publication, write something that they've just covered in the same way. You always want to be thinking of how you can advance the conversation. But I wish somebody had said, don't give up on your idea just because you've seen something like it before.
Well, hey there. Welcome to Media Savvy, the podcast that gives you a behind-the-scenes look at what it takes to get noticed by media and become the go-to expert that they keep coming back to. I'll be sitting down with successful writers, producers, and entrepreneurs to learn the tools and tactics they use to build their reputation and in turn boost their business. I'm your host, Taub-Dix, and I've been working with top-tier media outlets for more than 30 years, anywhere from traditional print publications to online and social platforms. And I'm sharing my nutrition guidance without gimmicks. But you don't have to be a dietitian for this podcast to speak to you. Through my one-to-one conversations, you'll learn how to build a strategy to get your name in the news and establish yourself as an authority in your field, no matter what the industry. With Media Savvy, I'm on a mission to inspire, motivate, and empower you to have the confidence and tools you need to shine in the spotlight. Are you ready? Let's get Media Savvy. Welcome to another episode of Media Savvy Podcast. Today's guest is Anna Medaris. When I met Anna, she was my editor at U.S. News and World Report, and I'm thrilled that she barely changed the stories that I handed in. But it was our Wind Down Wednesday dates that really helped me to get to know her and appreciate her talent. So let me tell you a little bit about Anna. Anna Medaris is a freelance health and lifestyle journalist with nearly 15 years of experience writing for publications including The Washington Post, Business Insider, Cosmopolitan, Women's Health, U.S. News and World Report, and Everyday Health. Anna is passionate about and so skilled in telling sensitive human interest stories, critiquing quirky cultural trends, which I know that we've done together, and answering questions you didn't even know you had. She's appeared on the Today Show, Good Morning America, Hulu's Age of Influence, and many local TV and radio stations. Anna is a recreational triathlete and beer enthusiast who lives in Brooklyn with her husband and basset hound, Lou Longbody. There are so many questions that I never actually got a chance to ask Anna, so here we go. Let's get started.
Thanks for having
Welcome,
me.
Anna.
Happy to be here.
So I always wondered, have you always enjoyed writing English essays when you were in school? Were you an incessant reader, or is this just a legend, or am I really talking about you? Can you tell us a little bit about your career path?
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I do tend to think about one moment in particular when I was in college when I had a big women's studies essay due, and I went to the big computer lab, which we called the fishbowl. And I was sitting there and I was getting really into it. And I love kind of figuring out the different structures and playing around with how to start or where different things go or where different thoughts go, and playing around with the wording and just really almost getting into that flow that people talk about when they're doing something that they love. And, just having the entire day go by and really absorbed in it. And noticing that everybody around me was miserable and like being in this big computer lab writing was the last thing they wanted to do. But for me, it was something that I loved doing. And that was kind of one of my first inklings that like, oh, maybe not everybody loves this. And this is something that writing and health is something that I should pursue. So yeah, I did have a little bit of an unconventional way here and career path, at least for sort of the traditional journalism path is to sort of, study journalism, do a lot of breaking news, kind of cut your teeth in the sort of generalist area and then specialize if you want to later on. And I kind of never did that. I always started in health and I started almost in more of a specialty area. And since then I've gone backwards in terms of like, I've broadened my scope. So my first jobs out of college were in trade publications and medical centers, writing for a medical audience. And so that kind of helped me, I really had to get it right. I had to get reading the studies and translating them right. Especially because my audience would be particularly critical because they were doctors, they were PhD researchers. In some cases, they were PhD psychologists. And so that, really forced me to understand the science, really practice that way. And then I kind of got to a point when I was at the American Psychological Association writing for their magazine, which I loved. But I was frustrated that like, all these wonderful stories about psychology and human behavior that were really rooted in the latest research was going into this magazine that was being delivered to psychologists' doors. And I had no idea, A, if they were reading it, and B, if they were reading it, was I just preaching to the choir because it was their work that I was reporting on. And, I went as far as to take these magazines with me whenever I was traveling and put them into the back seats of airplanes back when the seats of airplanes had magazines, because I just wanted everybody to read it who wasn't getting these simply because they weren't psychologists. So that was kind of an inkling of like, okay, I'm writing really cool things. There's a lot of really interesting research and work that people are doing in their labs that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily know about. And that really gave me the fire to eventually try to transition into a more mainstream role, which is where I am today.
That's so funny that you did that. When I used to write for Newsday, I used to go make photocopies of my column, which came out every 2 weeks. And I used to put my phone number on there and my business name. And I used to drop them off at doctors' offices. And the doctors loved it because it was in their waiting rooms. And then people called me. And that's actually how I built my local private practice. So you never know who was reading those stories. Well, that's interesting. But you've had many jobs that most of us would love, an editor at US News to working at Insiders. And were those roles very different? I'd love to know more about your transitional journey from one placement to another.
Yeah. So my roles at US News and Insider were quite different, or at least the environments of the companies were really different. So at US News, I was a reporter and editor covering health and wellness. And I had kind of the same routine for years. I had a deadline every Tuesday at 2 p.m. and every Thursday at 2 p.m. And in between, I've edited blogs like those that you wrote and other dietitians and health experts. And kind of monthly, I sent my pitches to my editors and they approved them most of the time. And I kind of had my layout for the month. And looking back on it, it was quite slow paced. When it was new to me, I thought it was super fast paced because before that I had been at APA where we were, in the print business where things have a much longer lead time. So the transition from APA to US News felt very, it was hard for me to write, 2 stories a week. And then that's funny looking back now, because then when I moved to Insider, it was closer to 2 stories a day. And it was a much more sort of traditional newsroom feel, super fast paced, super reactive to whatever the news was. And I think they just have very different sort of business models and different audiences. So I loved it. I love the beginning of sort of every job. I'm very much like, I like change. And I realize like whenever I move to a new city or take a new job or whatever is new is like very exciting to me. So, but when I moved to Insider, yeah, it was quite a shock to the system to be responsive that quickly. And also kind of going back to how I've kind of had this sort of reverse career trajectory as a lot of people. I felt like, by then I was in my mid 30s, and a lot of the people at Insider were straight out of college. And so that was their first job, and it was my third or fourth. But I was like, oh, this is great. Because before, a lot of my colleagues had been in their 40s and 50s. And all of a sudden, I was finally in these newsrooms with a lot of, fresh ideas and young energy. And it kind of felt like college again. So it was fun. I was the millennial kind of hanging out with all the clubs they had, they had the musical club and different events. So the culture there was really fun and very fast paced. And of course, that all changed when COVID hit, and I was covering health during all of that, which was quite an experience. But certainly kept me busy when we were all in lockdown.
And now you're a freelancer. You've transitioned into that role. And are you, after those newsrooms, are you enjoying being your own boss? And tell us about the difference between working in that kind of structured environment, even though it sounds like it was fun with the music clubs, to doing more independent work.
Yeah,
on
that's
your own.
also been quite a transition that I have loved. It kind of all of a sudden blows the top off of like all these sort of structures that you don't really question. And then you're kind of like, oh, there really are no rules. I remember going, the first maybe month or two of freelance, I like working from hotel lobbies. And I was there on like a Monday, at 11 a.m. and with my laptop. And I looked over and there were people like having a espresso martini. And I'm like, you could do that? All of a sudden it was just like, oh my gosh, there are no rules. All these things that corporate America has told us like are fake. I could do whatever I want, which was very freeing and very fun. And I realized, I found this sort of entrepreneurial spirit that I really never thought that I had. But all of a sudden when when you have to make money and you start thinking about things through the lens of how can I use my skills to make money, like it's actually kind of fun. It's fun to make money. It's fun to think about ways that you can pitch your writing and pitch your ideas and pitch and think about, I've tried to think about a lot of other ways that I can use writing and my various skills that I learned through journalism and not, in ways outside of traditional journalism work.
That does sound like fun. I know I've been on my own for a very long time, more than 30 years. So, maybe I need to think a little bit more about espresso martinis. I actually, I haven't tried that yet in the morning. But, one thing that's clear, is that when it comes to working with media, that establishing strong relationships is so important, no matter what position you're in. And I think that as a freelancer, sometimes you're on your own. And in my own experience, I've had writers come to me for expert quotes that later became editors of publications, and then they came to me with assignments. So those relationships remained so important. So as a freelancer, do assignments come your way because of your relationships with other journalists, or do you need to still perfect pitching?
Yeah, I think that I'm really lucky that, this is kind of the era of my career that I'm going freelance. And I've had almost 15 years in staff jobs where I've built a lot of connections. I think I would have had a lot harder time this past almost year if I was a pretty early career journalist and didn't have all of those relationships, which I have found, I didn't really plan to go freelance, but I kind of had set myself up for it without knowing. Not only do I have the experience and those contacts of places that I've worked, I'm just, as you know, quite a naturally social person, a natural connector. I've always held a lot of volunteer positions in various journalism organizations. I've just, I take it upon myself to get a bunch of health journalists together. I just have all these different groups of people that I'm always I'm the sort of one organizing the happy hours and things like that. And so I've just always kind of had a lot of what psychologists call loose ties, which are like the friends of the friends sort of people that kind of know you, but not that well. And they're actually really helpful to kind of always have on your radar because those are the people that can really make these connections because they're one circle outside of your immediate circle. So that's a long-winded way of saying, yeah, I've gotten almost, I would say 90% of my assignments have been assignments and not pitches that I have come up with myself. And they've come from all different directions. Some have been old editors, but some have been, I met a woman at a journalist Christmas party, and she had just been laid off, but her publication was still, she thought, taking health pitches. She was on a completely different beat. So she connected me with her editor there. And that was one of the 2 stories that I actually did pitch and land and didn't get assigned to me. But it's been a lot of my, personal connections, a lot of, I think the other thing I did too was just sort of announce on Twitter, on LinkedIn, when I went freelance, sort of put it out there. And, didn't necessarily ask for work, but just said, here's what I'm doing now. Here's what I'm excited about. And people actively reached out to me to introduce me to their editors, other people they knew, and just kind of spreading the word that way. So I found I had a safety net that I didn't know that I was weaving.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when you write a story, do you amplify it on social media? Speaking of LinkedIn and other
definitely.
platforms?
It does take some time, but it's fun. That's like one of the little like dopamine hits you get. I love seeing my byline. I love when stories are finally published, and so taking that time to put it on Twitter, put it on LinkedIn. I usually put it on my Instagram stories. Link to the other sources that I've used if they have a presence. It's fun to celebrate those little wins.
Yeah, and that's also the beauty of freelancing, is that you could actually use whatever content you want to use, say whatever you want to say, and put it wherever you want to put it. But I know that freelancing does come with its own set of rewards and challenges. There are many, many rewards. I think more rewards than challenges. But I do remember the days when I did not have to work late nights or weekends, and that's not the case anymore, especially when it comes to meeting deadlines or even covering breaking news. Sometimes when things happen and you want to report on it or need to report on it, it's not that convenient. So there's a lot of unpredictability, but it's also very self-driven, which you sound like you're perfectly set to do. But could you share some of the highs and lows that you experience as a freelancer?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think as we've talked about, the freedom is a high. I think I've also discovered that, at least for me, and I am more of a features, narratives, long form, at heart person than I am a breaking news person. And so for that sort of, that skill and that desire, for me, it makes so much more sense to get these assignments that are by project instead of, when I was at Insider, at least, I was online 9 to 6, Monday through Friday. If I took my dog for a walk, I would have to tell my editor, I had to pretty much be tied to my computer and writing during those hours, or reporting or pitching, or, but just being on. And all of a sudden to flip that and be like, oh, actually, you're getting paid for the final product, and however you want to do it is up to you. I really like that structure. Because sometimes I do want to write on Sunday afternoon and not on Tuesday afternoon. And of course, if you're responding to breaking news, you have to be on at a certain time. But the kinds of stories that I'm writing, I really have to match with the sort of flow of my energy at that point in the day or the week. And it's a lot easier to do that when you're getting paid by project. Some of the downsides are some of the obvious is of course, not a very predictable income. And sometimes, I'll think that I'm getting X amount for this month, but then it's like, by the time you're actually invoicing, is many, many months after you actually got the assignment. And then you have to wait another maybe 30 days before you actually see that check. So that's definitely been an adjustment that I'm still trying to sort of figure out how to find some stability. And the other thing, this isn't like a heavy downside, but it's something that I hadn't really thought so much about before. And just sort of when you're working with, 3, 4, 5 different clients or editors at the same time, you do have to build in time for your schedule for the edits to come back, and for just some flexibility, because, at least when you're on staff and you're reporting to one person, they know what your workload looks like, and they can help you prioritize, write this one before that one, or put this on the back burner, or this is more important right now. But when you're working for 5 different editors who aren't talking to each other, and frankly don't care that you're working for 4 other editors, you have to figure out how you're going to please them all, because you can't tell somebody, oh, well, this this other publication wants me to write this first. That's not going to fly. So it's up to you to prioritize.
This reminds me of when my kids were in high school. And I remember when they would say, I can't believe I have all these assignments. This teacher doesn't know that this one is giving the, and okay, actually this is like the ultimate of where you finally get to a place where you're actually being paid for these things and no one cares what else you're doing. They just care about what they want you to do for them. And a lot of that also has to do with deadlines and their deadlines. And I know that for myself, in my media training course and when I teach students, I always tell them that when a reporter gives you a deadline, don't meet it. You need to beat it. And the reason why I say this is because I know when I send out queries, if I say, I need your answers by next Friday, but I get 10 responses by Tuesday and I have time on Wednesday to write the story, then maybe the people who are sending it in on Friday, unless it's something spectacular, I may already be done with my story and then that's a little bit too late. So how much leeway time do you give when you ask for responses for your queries?
I try to be pretty clear. Like I'll say sort of, my deadline is Monday, so I need to wrap up interviews by Thursday, or I'll be writing this on Friday, so I need to receive these before then. So I think, and I am pretty deadline oriented and tend to, write the day before, if it's not like a super long story, but I'll write the couple days before my deadline. And so I wish that I had I've got some extra time on Wednesday. I'm going to beat my deadline, but I tend to be up to the wire. But I agree with you. That said, if you're one of the first or some of the first answers to come in, if it's an email Q&A, then that's going to sort of help me start to structure the story. And if you're the last one in where I've already written most of it or all of it, at that point, I'm just going to maybe see, is there a quote here I can drop in, but you might not get as much airtime, if you will.
Yeah, there are some reporters, including yourself, by the way, that when I hear from them, I actually drop what I'm doing and I just get right back to them because I know that they appreciate that. I know that that helps them to come back to me right away. But I also think that it's important because I know the pressure they're under. And I know that it's not like it used to be, or in certain worlds where you could write a story a week or something like that. So many of the people that I work with are writing so many stories a day, as you described. And, I just try to help alleviate their pressure.
I think too, and when I get the same sort of things, it's easier if you can just answer right then. I know if I'm like, I'll send questions to this person by Friday, if I have the time to like write that on my to-do list, maybe I can just do it now. And then it's off your plate as well when you respond quickly.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I feel the same way. And I know that people who are listening want to be relied upon by journalists. So when you look to choose someone to provide an expert quote in a story, because we know that these days there are so many influencers with air quotes out there who may have a gigantic following on social media, but that's not necessarily reflective of their credibility. So what gives you the comfort in knowing that someone who you're interviewing is credible? And do you research a lot of people ahead of time? I kind of know the answer to this, but I sort of want to hear you say it, before you interview someone for your story?
Yeah, I would say like a lot of every publication I've written for has pretty strict guidelines around this. So, I would do it and they would enforce that essentially, it needs to generally be, an MD. If we're talking about a medical issue, if we're talking about nutrition, it needs to be an RD, things like that are a little more open to interpretation, like a health coach or something that, doesn't have a sort of governing body to certify them. Usually, even if I was, say, a new journalist that didn't realize that a health coach might not be the best person and interviewed them, I think that would get caught by an editor and they'd say, you need to go interview an RD. So I think there's a lot of sort of in at least reputable journalism organizations, like they do have a lot of standards for who the sources need to be in their education level. So I'm not swayed. In fact, I don't usually almost turns me off if it's somebody who's just like a super influencer. I really value people who are in the field and maybe don't have as much time to just be posting all the time. So, I obviously want the education and the credentials there. But I have my sort of roster of people that I rely on frequently, like you. But I also try to encourage other journalists to open up their mind and their sources, to people that maybe aren't talking to the media all the time, and find them in sort of unconventional ways. Like I just interviewed a podiatrist who is in my triathlon club, and I found him because I never actually met him, but I found him because we have a listserv, and I was just Googling searching my inbox for podiatrist for one of my assignments. It was about foot pain. And I was like, I don't think I've actually interviewed a podiatrist before. I don't have like a go-to. And I just, searched my inbox, and he had responded to a query related, to my triathlon group. And I was like, oh, this guy seems like he knows what he's talking about. I have something in common with him. But he's not, like all over the media. So he was really easy to talk to, and not, sometimes you can get like too cookie cutter of responses when people are almost like, just like so used to talking to the media, and they say the same things over and over, and they're not even that excited about it anymore. So it's fun to find some fresh voices, as long as they've got the credentials.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm sure you get pitched a lot. I know that I receive so many emails from publicists who say, hey, are you interested in talking about XYZ? Well, I have the perfect person for you. And there have been a few, very few times when I actually have reached out to someone because I liked a lot of the stuff that they were saying about them. But most of the time I just do delete. Because it seems like it's somebody who's going to be very polished, but not necessarily in a relatable way, more polished in a way where they know their sound bites. They say the same thing to everyone. And I'm not really looking for that either. So yeah, I agree with you on that. So, I would love to hear a little bit about kind of how you write, because I know when I write a story, sometimes I'll write the end first. Sometimes I'll only have a title and I don't know what else I want to say. Sometimes I know there's somebody I really want to interview for this subject, but I don't really know what we're going to talk about. So can you tell us about your process and your approach to a project or writing a piece? Do you actually have a strategy, or do things just unfold as you go along?
I think, it starts with the pitch. So if I have an idea, I'll just think about like one that I'm just going through edits for now I'm writing for APA's Monitor again, which is great because I wrote for them 10 plus years ago on staff. And so I know how they work. One of my editors is still there. And I pitched them a story about fence sitters, or people who aren't sure if they want kids or not, and all of the sort of psychology behind it, what's going on in our world today that are making people hesitant to have kids, and also like the clinical side, and if talking to psychologists about how they're counseling their patients who are dealing with this issue. It's something that I'm thinking about in my personal life, talking to friends a lot about, talking to my husband a lot about. So I was kind of like, hey, this is free therapy. I get to interview like as many psychologists as I want about this issue. And I'm going to get paid instead of paying them. So that's one little workaround. But anyway, so for that, it starts with a little idea like that came to me, of course, in the shower. And then I kind of, put together a working headline, a little bit of a description, and a lot of the writing and the pitch too. You have to start actually writing it, at least for me. Like, I don't even know necessarily what I'm thinking or what the nut graph is or what the main point is until I'm kind of like writing out my pitch. And then, as I'm writing the pitch, if it doesn't feel like hefty enough, then I'll do a little research, maybe do a little one interview ahead of time to kind of get a little bit more structure to it. But once I have a pitch, which has, basically the point of the story, if there's any tension, who I might interview, and I'm ready to write, if it's approved, for better or worse, I am one of these people that like cannot move on until I love my opening. So I'll write my, first couple graphs so many times before I can like move on to the next, or the meat of the story in the end. And, this just happened with that same story. I probably spent hours like with this beautiful opening, with this anecdote of this man who's been on both sides of the fence. And then he saw this man in the park with his son, and he's like, oh, maybe I do want to be a father. And anyway, I painted this whole picture, and I thought it was a great opening, and the whole thing got cut because they wanted it to be more of a news story and to just get to the point, and not such a feature-y opening. So, I've learned my lesson. Sometimes you can't spend too long because if it's going to go through a lot of different hands after that, it might not have, it might be just wasted time. But it's also not wasted time because it just helped me get into the story, and maybe the rest of it wouldn't have been as strong if I hadn't liked the beginning. But yeah, so my process, and I've tried a couple. I'm not an outliner. Sometimes I've had editors who want an outline, and for me, I'll have kind of a general idea of the different sort of sections that I want to cover. But once I get too detailed, like for me, I just have to start writing. And I do often know the ending. I'll hear usually a quote during my interviews, and I'll be like, that's the kicker. And same with the opening. I'll often during interviews know, like, this is how I want to start the story. But backing up a little too. So after the pitch, then I'll do all my outreach for interviews, do some research. Once all my interviews are done, then I'll kind of go back through my transcripts, highlight quotes and things like that, and then I start writing. So I think some people probably start writing in the middle of their interviews. I kind of like to bucket it all, and once I'm done, then I start the writing process.
It's so funny. You just made me think of a story that I was once doing for a magazine, and they sent me the pitch. They knew exactly what they wanted. I wrote the whole story. It took me forever. And, in those days, I don't know what they're paying now, but it was $2 a word. So he was so happy to be able to write this long story for a magazine. And I remember that after I handed it in, it went to one editor. She liked it. She sent it to another editor, and she said, we love the title. We love the first paragraph, but you need to change the rest of it. So all of the rest of the stuff got scrapped. So yeah, I know what that's like. And when you get a pitch, at least you have some sort of idea about what they're looking for. But what about stories that inspire you? Where do you get your inspiration from, and how do you continue to learn and grow in your own profession?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'm definitely a big reader of magazines. I now am backlogged on 2 New York magazines. I love them so much. I won't let myself read them online or read I wait till the conditions are perfect, like a Saturday morning at a coffee shop, and then I just savor reading through them. So I love, reading good journalism. I think I've also found a lot of community in the freelance world that I had no idea existed before. But there are so many groups. There's Slack groups, there's newsletters, there's meetups, there's all kinds of things. There's frankly a lot more freelance writers out there than there are staff writers. So there's a lot of ways, a ton of Facebook groups for writers and editors. So I found those are helpful to kind of just, people are sharing their ideas and asking questions, and kind of, it's a way to sort of keep your head in the game and make sure that you're, knowing what other people are talking about, since you're not in overhearing things in a newsroom. But it is something I'm trying to think about too. And I don't know the answer to, in terms of I don't have a sort of managing editor to help me every year or quarterly go through my goals and think about where I want to go from here, and will I get a promotion? And, that all goes out the window when you're your own boss. So, in a way I have more freedom to create the career I want. But on the other hand, I'm also just sort of day to day trying to make my next deadline, and sometimes can forget to create time to take a step back and think about bigger career goals.
It is tough. It is tough. And I'm not very goal oriented. You would never know that, since I've been in business for more than 30 years. You would think I had a plan. I never really did. And I was always lucky that things came to me. But it is good to think about, because when you're a freelancer, there is that excitement of having the freedom to do whatever you want, but that is not necessarily lucrative unless you have some ideas about how you could have that combo, the balance of fun and take that time for yourself, like that Tuesday you described, but sometimes you have to be willing to work on that Sunday when you otherwise may not have. So yeah, it is a good balance, but I love it too. And I know that when you write stories, that you're not exactly writing, 10 tips to do whatever. You write very in-depth stories about either severe medical conditions, or let's just say people who have not been cared for necessarily properly by medical professionals. So is there any particular story that really had an impact on you? Because when I've read some of your stories, it's like, wow, I would never even think that that existed. Could you tell us about maybe one story that stood out?
And I will say I'm not above the 10 tips too. I definitely get I get a lot of assignments from Everyday Health that tend to be kind of SEO driven or a TikTok trend. So, I've written about resting bitch face and yeah, the
We
foot
did
pain
that.
one, things like that are pretty straightforward. But yeah, the ones that I'm more proud of are one that stands out right away when you asked that was probably 5 years ago. I wrote about maternal suicide and sort of this under captured population, which is heartbreaking. I think we are talking more about maternal or postpartum depression and postpartum anxiety, and even psychosis a little bit. But there is this, fortunately small, but also underreported on group of women who do die by suicide soon after giving birth. And I was lucky enough to be able to talk to some of these women who had been close to being part of those statistics. And really being able to tell their stories. And also, I've learned there was no real good, and still isn't, way to even count these deaths because they can be captured as something else. And so it's kind of this, it was heartbreaking, but it was also really rewarding to be able to share these women's stories who had felt so desperate at one point, and hopefully maybe capture some people who were feeling like they were the only people that felt like this as new moms. That one has really stuck with me. And then on the other, completely other end of the spectrum, one of my favorite stories I ever wrote was about a pole dancing competition in DC. And the final story is a fun read. But the thing that always sticks with me with that one is it was the actual process and how much I loved the editor that I worked with. This was for the Washington Post magazine. And unfortunately, I think they shuttered a couple years ago, which is too bad because it was a fun one. But yeah, I was probably 25. I was in grad school living in DC, and I had pitched this to the editor there, and who had been a speaker at my grad school program. And he was probably in his, a white man in his 60s. But for whatever reason, we had the same sense of humor, and we would get on the phone to talk through my latest drafts. And we would just be like, I remember sitting in my office and like not being able to catch my breath. And he was like silent on the phone because we both were laughing so hard we couldn't breathe. And it was just like so fun to like connect with somebody on that way that like we didn't have that much else in common. But it was just a great collaboration. And I wish I could find more editors that I have that bond with, because I think everybody now, it's hard too when you're in freelance, to get that sort of counsel if you're not somebody that they're really trying to, really try to build their skills and to be sort of on staff for life if they're sort of just, editing one story and moving on.
And, so much has also changed since the pandemic, because it used to be, even if you were in a newsroom, you got to see your editors and you got to know people. I think that now there's that gap where you don't even know them. Like sometimes when I'm invited to an event, I always hope that they have name tags, even though they're kind of corny, but I'll be shocked when I run into somebody that I have worked with for years and I never even saw their face. So journalism itself has changed so much, even from the way that we read. I still love to hold magazines, as you say, New York Magazine. I love to hold magazines. I love to hold books in my hand so I can flip through the pages. But many of us just read with phones in our hands. They're not holding books and magazines. So with your background in health and wellness and consumer news, where do you see the future of journalism going, especially in these areas related to health? Because so much of it is not what you're reporting based upon science, but it's more like, TMI about somebody's own experience, but not in a way that is capturing attention because they want to educate. It's more about being sensational.
Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful. I think, there's always going to be new health research that needs to be in health innovations and changes in medicine, and of course, new diets and things like that. There's never going to be an absence of health news that people need to learn about. I think just, yeah, the ways that people are learning about it is different. And I do think that right now there are probably a lot more people who want to be full-time writers than there is real space for in sort of traditional journalism. But I do think, they're just going to have to, and I'll put myself in this category too, like find other ways, whether it's doing more sort of marketing, writing, or advertising for health companies, or just using your writing skills in other ways. But I do think that like print stuff is almost sort of coming back, or might a little bit, because the way that we sort of over correct when things are new, and all of a sudden, when everybody's only reading online, then all of a sudden, oh, picking up a magazine feels so like cute and quaint again, and it kind of will have a comeback, I think. And the same way of like people are like now, like dating apps are so sort of, people are so sick of them, they want to meet in real life, like isn't that cute, like all these sort of things circle back. um, and I know you want to talk about AI, but one thing that I've been thinking about with like, I'm almost, some of the stories that I don't really get excited about are the ones that essentially could be written by AI, the ones that are sort of the SEO, just, plug in the answer to this question here, here, and here. And those are the sort of things that don't necessarily require a lot of creativity or brain power on my end. And therefore, you might eventually be able to, the publications use some sort of AI for those sorts of stories, or just not put them in the news category, put them in more of a sort of a WebMD sort of place. And that gives, people like me who really like want to come up with our own ideas and see our own ideas come to life, or add commentary, or bring in fresh voices or a fresh perspective. That's not something that technology can do, but like humans and creativity can do. And that's the part of writing that I like the most.
I was reluctant to use AI at all. And then my kids encouraged me to try it. So one of them told me that I should put my own name in there out of curiosity. And I was actually humbled at this glowing description that they had for me in my bio, but nestled within my bio, it said that I graduated with honors from Queens College. Totally untrue. Never even went there. It also said that I was a member of the board of the New York State Dietetic Association. So not true. Never did. So obviously we need to use AI judiciously. So do you use it in your writing at all?
I've just started to dabble a little, not in my writing, but more in sort of the brainstorming phase. So I have, mostly for headlines, I wrote this story for APA about psychologists who are consulting in the entertainment industry in Hollywood. So a lot of people who are working with script writers to make sure that mental health portrayals are accurate and sensitive, people working with actors for their portrayals of mental health issues. So super interesting story. I was like, how, we have to come up with a kind of a clever headline for such a fun sort of Hollywood glamour story. And so I just went to ChatGPT and was like, can you give me 5 headlines for a magazine story about psychologists in Hollywood? And they come up with some corny stuff, but we did end up using some part of one of them, which was something like, behind the screens, which isn't like that great, but it, like, I didn't come up with it first. So, it kind of can at least get your, it's like a brainstorming partner in a way where you're like, oh, I didn't think of that phrase or that word. And then you can kind of make it your own from there. And then there's one other way I used it. Just wrote a story for Women's Health magazine about elite athletes with ADHD. And one of the athletes I interviewed was an Olympic shot putter. And I know nothing about shot put, but I really wanted to, this was also cut, but my first draft, I opened with a description of what actually is involved when you're throwing a shot put. Because I thought maybe that could be a way to kind of show how this brain type works. But I don't know anything about shot put. So I went, and I did some research, but it was like either super in the weeds or super too broad for me to really wrap my head around it to describe it. So I just went to Chat GPT and said, how do you throw a shot put in like 10 steps or something? And that kind of, it broke it down for me in a way that I could then try to describe it myself. So I think it can be helpful, mostly brainstorming or to get you to an answer quicker, but I would never want it to write for me.
I agree. Sometimes it comes up with a word that's like, wow, that's a good word. And other times it just doesn't sound like anything that I would possibly say. So I agree with you 100% on that one. When it comes to writing, speaking of having certain words, I remember when I got my first job for a newspaper, and my editor said she had the best advice for me. And she said, write for a fourth grade audience. And I thought that was kind of condescending for the readers. But then I realized what she really meant, which is something that I've spoken on this show so many times with my guests. And that's that you have to speak in the audience, in the language of the audience that you're speaking to, not just talk about what you want to talk about and the way you love to say it. You really have to meet people where they're at. So, in your experience and your strategies, you talk about such complex topics and you do base your information upon science, but you make it really interesting and easy. How do you do that?
Big question. I think, the fourth grade analogy does get used a lot. I think for me, it's more about writing how you talk for the most part, or how you would talk, and I was guilty of not doing that when I was younger. And I famously subscribed to a dictionary.com word of the day that would come into my email. And I had this personal challenge. I thought it was personal to try to use that word in whatever I was writing that day. And at one point, my editor was like, you gotta ditch the dictionary.com words because I didn't even know what they meant before that morning. And you would never use them in conversation. And you try to sound smart, but then you just sound out of touch or that you're trying too hard. And I think the best writing is really conversational and is how you would talk. So that's sort of my advice there. And then also when it comes to sort of more medical complex topics, it really just comes down to I have to really learn it. And if, when you're trying to basically just use the medical language, you can kind of skirt around understanding what it actually means if you're kind of just parroting what the doctors say. But if you, take the time to read and talk to more people and whatever you need to do to understand what you're writing about, the easier it is to then convey that to the average person. So it's almost like the more complex words you use, the more you're trying to kind of hide behind the fact that you don't actually know what you're talking about, which I think is the same. Can be said for length. A lot of people, and I agree, think it's harder to write short than it is long, because the shorter it is, the more you really have to know what you're talking about and get to the point instead of sort of dancing around the fact that you don't know what you're talking about.
I think that is so true. And I remember that when I wrote my first blog, and before that, I actually had to look up when I was given an assignment. It was by USA Today. They wanted to start a blog and I didn't even know what a blog was. So I looked it up to see what it was. And I thought, wow, are you kidding me? I could actually write in the way that I speak. And that changed my world in terms of my writing, because then I knew that I could even do that in most pieces. I mean, obviously not for a scientific journal, but I love the whole world of blogging because you really can be yourself. And even when I write a speech, I usually write my speech out in the way that I would say it. And then I record it on my phone and then try to learn it that way, because then I'm going to be the most authentic that I could be when I give that presentation. And the same with my writing. I want my voice to come through. To me, it's such a compliment when people say they read something that I wrote and that they can picture me saying it.
I agree.
Well, anyway, I have had so much fun talking to you and I really learned so much. So thank you so much. And at the end of my show, I usually ask 2 questions to my guests. One, is looking back on your journey in the media landscape. What is one piece of advice that you wish you received when you first started? And the other is just to please give us a tip that you could give to aspiring journalists or writers to help them become more media savvy.
Sure. One thing I wish I had learned earlier was that essentially it's okay if the idea has been done before. I think I probably threw away a lot of ideas because I saw that somebody else had written something similar. But pretty much everything has been written before, and like you can always bring your voice to it, a new angle to it, new updates in the research. Bring it to a different audience. If an idea is really good, there's different ways to get at it, and you can't. If you think you have something fresh to add, you don't need to abandon it. And in things, I was listening to a podcast the other day that was more about book writing, and they said the same thing where a lot of new writers will say, "Well, I want to write a memoir about grief," but there's already books about grief, but like that doesn't matter. Your story of grief is different. And there's always going to be a fresh audience of people who are losing people, and they're going to go to whatever the latest book is or article. And they don't necessarily know that 5 years ago, somebody else wrote something similar. So you obviously don't want to just, if you're pitching a publication, write something that they've just covered in the same way. You always want to be thinking of how you can advance the conversation. But I wish somebody had said, don't give up on your idea just because you've seen something like it before. And then
so true.
One of my tips, I do a pitching workshop for the New York Writing Room about twice a year. And kind of my biggest takeaway from that is essentially that it's not about the pitch. And this is for whether you're a writer, but almost more so for PR people who are pitching. I find that a lot of people really fixate on the sort of structure of their pitches, and they ask a lot of questions about, well, should I bold the title and do it in bullets, or should I put this word in the subject line? And I'm kind of like, at the end of the day, if the actual story idea or whatever you're pitching is not good or not right for that publication, it doesn't matter how beautifully you've packaged it or if you've done everything right in terms of subject lines or bullets or whatever. You can't disguise the bad idea. Of course, good ideas still deserve good packaging. So it is important to be smart about how you're pitching and make sure that it gets noticed. But I would spend your energy on developing a really good idea and the right sources than I would spend on the formatting of your email.
So you must get a ton of pitches though, especially when you were working for Insider. So is it the subject line that would make you even open a pitch? Let's say it didn't come from someone that you knew.
Yeah. One thing that would make me open is anything that surprises me. So if it's like a term I hadn't heard before that I want to learn more about, or something, something that catches my eye because I haven't heard it before. One example I use there is like, I got a pitch about Zoom dysmorphia back in probably 2020, and I ended up writing about it. And essentially the concept that, people were getting overly fixated on their appearance during Zoom calls because all of a sudden, you're having these conversations where in the real world and even in the office, you would just be looking at the person that you're talking to's face. But now all of a sudden, you're basically looking at in a mirror and the person you're talking to's face. And this was, it could be irritating to a lot of people, but then it was actually quite damaging to people who had body image issues and body dysmorphia and things like that. So, but the term Zoom dysmorphia in the headline caught my eye because I could kind of get an idea of what that meant. And I was probably dealing with it myself, but I had never heard it termed like that. And so I opened it up.
Interesting. Maybe we should use ChatGPT for pitch subject lines. You never know. There you go. Well, Anna, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to share? And please tell our listeners where they could learn more about your work.
I am just Anna Medaris at all of the socials. That's also my website, annamadaris.com. Just yesterday, I had a print story published in Women's Health Magazine. This one's speaking of AI. I wrote that
Nice.
one. So go to your local newsstand and pick up the May-June issue if it's still out when this airs. And I'm also available for writing coaching through the New York Writing Room. I can do, 1 hour one-on-one sessions, workshopping pitches, going through edits for anything, brainstorming ideas of where to pitch things, sort of whatever you think I can help you with. I am here and would be happy to meet any of your listeners.
Thank you so much. And I know that when you are doing workshop with the New York Writers Room, that you do put that on LinkedIn. So if someone followed you on LinkedIn, they'd be able to find when you're going to be doing that.
Keep active there and promote my upcoming workshops.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. That is a wrap for today's episode of Media Savvy, and big thanks to Anna Medaris for talking with us about her media journey today and giving us a few insider tips on what writers are looking for. And if you enjoyed today's episode as much as I did, please subscribe, write a review, and you know how much I'd love it if you would tell your friends about our show. So remember, it's not just about getting your name out there, it's about connecting with your audience in meaningful ways. So be sure to tune in next time. And until then, follow @BTD Media on Instagram for insider tips and tricks. Don't be shy. Throw me a message. Ask me questions. And by the way, you are looking very media savvy today. And I'm Bonnie saying goodbye for now and see you in the spotlight.